Imagine discovering that you possess a gift that could change the fate of thousands of people, but that no one takes you seriously. Imagine carrying the weight of having uttered the most important prophecy of the 20th century, the prophecy that sealed the fate of the most dangerous wizard of all time and an innocent baby, but not remembering a single word of what you said. This is the story of Sybill Trelawney, the seer everyone underestimated, the eccentric professor who lived among teacups and crystal balls, but who, unknowingly, determined the course of the Second Wizarding War. Before we continue this fascinating journey through the world of divination and the mysteries surrounding one of Hogwarts' most misunderstood professors, I need your support. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel. It's quick, it's free, and you'll be supporting the production of more content like this. And tell me here in the comments, which city are you watching this video from? I love knowing where each of you who are part of this incredible community comes from. Now yes, let's start from the beginning, because to understand Sybill Trelawney, we must first understand where she came from and the legacy she carried on her shoulders from the day she was born. Sybill Patricia Trelawney was born on March 9th, 1965, somewhere in Great Britain. She didn't come from just any family in the wizarding world. No, Sybill carried in her veins the blood of one of the most celebrated and respected seers of all time, Cassandra Trelawney, her great-great-grandmother, and here is the first burden that Sybill would carry her entire life. Cassandra Trelawney was not an ordinary seer. She was a true seer with a capital S, someone who truly possessed the gift of inner vision. In the wizarding community, there are thousands of people who call themselves fortune tellers, who read tea leaves, who interpret crystal balls, who make vague and generic predictions. But true seers, those are extremely rare, so rare that many wizards go their entire lives without ever meeting a single one. Cassandra Trelawney was one of those rare exceptions. Her prophecies were documented, respected, studied. She had predicted important events, her visions materialized, and her name was revered in divination circles. Imagine then growing up as the great-great-granddaughter of this legendary woman. Imagine the expectations, the pressure, the hopeful looks whenever someone discovered your surname. And it was exactly this that shaped Sybill's life from very early on. She grew up hearing stories about her illustrious ancestor. She grew up knowing that everyone expected her to inherit that extraordinary gift. Her parents, her family, all looked at her searching for signs, hoping that little Sybill would demonstrate having inherited Cassandra's inner vision. But the years passed, and nothing happened. Sybill was an ordinary child, an ordinary witch. She didn't have visions, didn't go into trances, didn't see the future unfolding before her eyes. And this, as you can imagine, created a deep wound in her soul. A wound she would spend the rest of her life trying to heal, trying to prove to the world and to herself that she was worthy of the Trelawney name. When it came time to attend Hogwarts, Sybill was selected for Ravenclaw House, the house of the wise, of scholars, of those who value intelligence and learning above all else. And it was there, among the corridors of Ravenclaw Tower and the vast libraries of Hogwarts, that Sybill began to dive deeply into the study of divination. If she didn't have the natural gift, then she would study. She would learn all the techniques, all the methods, all the ways to try to achieve what her great-great-grandmother possessed naturally. She devoured books about reading tea leaves, about dream interpretation, about astrology, palmistry, crystal gazing. She studied everything there was to study about divination. And here we need to pause to understand something crucial. Divination in the wizarding world is an extremely controversial discipline. Many wizards and witches, including respected professors like Minerva McGonagall, consider divination a very imprecise form of magic, full of assumptions and vague interpretations. Hermione Granger, one of the brightest minds of her generation, abandoned the subject completely for considering it a waste of time. But why does this controversy exist? Because true prophecy, true inner vision, cannot be taught. You're born with it, or you're not. It's a rare, unpredictable gift that doesn't respond to study or practice. A person can spend decades studying divination and never have a single true vision. Meanwhile, a true seer can have prophecies without ever having studied a single day. And Sybill Trelawney would spend most of her life in this painful limbo, studying tirelessly something she couldn't really do. After graduating from Hogwarts, Sybill tried to build a career as a professional seer. She offered her services in tea reading, crystal ball interpretation, astrological analysis. But the truth is, she wasn't very successful. Her predictions were vague, generic, the kind that could apply to anyone in any situation. She would predict things like, "You will face a difficult challenge soon," or "A person from your past will return to your life." Predictions that are so broad that they eventually come true in one way or another for anyone. There was nothing extraordinary, nothing that remotely resembled Cassandra Trelawney's talent. And then came the year 1979, the year that would change Sybill's life forever, even though she didn't know it at that moment. Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, was looking for a new divination professor. The position had been vacant for some time, and although Dumbledore didn't have great appreciation for the discipline, he knew many students wished to study it. Besides, keeping the subject in the curriculum was part of Hogwarts tradition. Sybill Trelawney, desperate for an opportunity to prove her worth and carry her family name with dignity, applied for the position. Dumbledore scheduled an interview with her at the Hog's Head, a pub in Hogsmeade known for being less respectable than the Three Broomsticks, frequented by wizards of dubious reputation. It was a cold afternoon when Sybill arrived at the Hog's Head. She was nervous, anxious, desperate to make a good impression on the most powerful and respected wizard of her time. She had prepared everything she would say, how she would present herself, how she would demonstrate her deep knowledge of divination. Dumbledore received her politely, but from the beginning of the conversation, it became clear to him that Sybill possessed no real gift of seeing. She knew the theory, had studied extensively, but there was nothing extraordinary about her. Her answers were rehearsed, her interpretations were conventional. There was no spark of that rare and mysterious gift that characterizes a true seer. Dumbledore had already decided to refuse her politely. He would be kind, of course. He didn't want to hurt the woman, but he simply saw no reason to hire her when she demonstrated no genuine ability in the area she intended to teach. And then it happened. In the middle of the conversation, without any warning, Sybill's eyes became unfocused. Her voice changed completely, becoming harsh, deep, totally different from her usual high-pitched and nebulous tone. She entered a deep trance, and the words that came out of her mouth would make history in the wizarding world. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the seventh month dies. And then, as suddenly as it began, the trance ended. Sybill blinked, confused, looking at Dumbledore without having the slightest idea of what had just happened. She didn't remember anything, absolutely nothing of what she had said. For her, it had been just a moment of disconnection, a brief lapse in her consciousness, but Dumbledore knew exactly what he had just witnessed. He had witnessed a true prophecy, uttered by a true seer. In that moment, Sybill Trelawney had finally demonstrated that she did carry, yes, the gift of her great-great-grandmother. It was dormant, rare, unpredictable, but it was there. And more than that, the prophecy she had just made was of devastating importance. Dumbledore understood immediately the implications of those words. There was a child to be born, a child who would have the power to defeat Voldemort, the most dangerous dark wizard in centuries. Dumbledore hired Sybill immediately, but it wasn't just because of the prophecy, although that was obviously an important factor. He hired her also to keep her safe. If Voldemort discovered about the prophecy, If he knew that someone had predicted his downfall, he would hunt Sybill without mercy. Keeping her inside Hogwarts, protected by the castle's defenses and under his direct supervision, was the only way to guarantee her safety. And there's one more crucial detail here. The interview didn't happen in a completely private location. There was someone listening behind the door, someone who heard part of the prophecy before being discovered and expelled from the pub. That someone was Severus Snape, who at the time still served Voldemort as a Death Eater. Snape ran to tell his master what he had heard, and that's how Voldemort learned of the existence of a prophecy about his defeat. He didn't hear the complete prophecy, didn't know all the details, but he knew enough to be alarmed and begin searching for this child who supposedly had the power to destroy him. And we all know what that resulted in. Voldemort identified two babies who could fit the prophecy: Harry Potter, son of James and Lily Potter, and Neville Longbottom, son of Frank and Alice Longbottom. Both were born at the end of July, both sons of parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. Voldemort chose Harry. He invaded the Potter's house in Godric's Hollow on the night of October 31st, 1981. He killed James, killed Lily, and tried to kill Harry. But something extraordinary happened. The spell rebounded, Voldemort was destroyed, reduced to less than a ghost, and Harry survived with only a lightning bolt-shaped scar on his forehead. The prophecy had begun to be fulfilled. Voldemort had marked Harry as his equal by choosing him, by attacking him, by leaving part of his own soul in the boy without knowing. And Sybill Trelawney? She was unaware of any of this. She knew she had been hired, was happy to have finally gotten the position at Hogwarts, but had no idea of the monumental role she had played in the events that were shaping the wizarding world. Think of the tragic irony of this situation. Sybill spent her entire life trying to prove she was a true seer, that she was worthy of Cassandra Trelawney's legacy, and when she finally had a genuine vision, the most important prophecy in decades, she didn't remember anything. She couldn't enjoy the validation, couldn't feel the power of that moment. For her, it was just a void in her memory. And so began Sybill Trelawney's life as divination professor at Hogwarts. She settled in the north tower of the castle, at the top of a silver staircase that appeared and disappeared, leading to a circular room full of curtains, cushions, poufs, and lit by a reddish light coming from a fireplace and lamps covered with shawls. The scent of sweet perfume permeated the environment, creating an atmosphere that many found suffocating, but that Sybill considered appropriate for the study of divination. She rarely descended from the tower. Sybill developed the habit of taking her meals in her quarters, avoiding the great hall where the other professors gathered. Part of this was her eccentric and reclusive nature. Part was the fact that many of the other professors didn't take her subject seriously. Minerva McGonagall, in particular, didn't hide her disdain for divination. She considered the discipline a waste of time, full of unfounded assumptions and vague interpretations. The two professors had a tense relationship, although they maintained the basic cordiality required among colleagues. During the years that followed, Sybill taught generations of students. She taught reading tea leaves, dream interpretation, card reading, crystal gazing with crystal balls. Her classes followed a predictable pattern. She made dramatic predictions about imminent deaths, usually involving some unfortunate student she chose to be the bearer of the worst omens. And here's something fascinating. Sybill was constantly predicting terrible deaths, horrible tragedies, imminent disasters. But these predictions never materialized. They were just part of her dramatic style, part of the atmosphere she tried to create. They weren't true visions, they were just the kind of generic and sensationalist prediction she had learned to make. Students had varied reactions to her. Some found her classes fascinating and mysterious. Others, like Hermione Granger, considered it all a complete farce. Hermione abandoned the subject after a few classes, unable to tolerate what she saw as obvious charlatanism. But there was one student that Sybill repeatedly chose as the target of her darkest predictions: Harry Potter. Since Harry arrived at Hogwarts in the early 90s, Sybill became strangely fixated on him. She constantly saw omens of death around him, predicted he wouldn't survive the year, saw terrible signs in his tea readings. It was as if something in her subconscious recognized Harry's importance, even though her conscious mind didn't know exactly why. Dumbledore never told Sybill about the prophecy she had made. He kept it secret, protecting her from knowledge that could put her in even greater danger. So Sybill continued her life, not knowing that the boy whose death she constantly predicted was actually the subject of her only true prophecy. The years passed. Sybill continued living in her tower, giving her classes, making her dramatic but empty predictions. She drank more and more sherry, becoming known for her habit of keeping bottles hidden in her quarters. Alcohol was a way to deal with loneliness, with the frustration of never having had another true vision, with the burden of constantly trying to prove something she herself wasn't sure she possessed. And then came the year 1995. And everything began to change. Dolores Umbridge was appointed High Inquisitor of Hogwarts by the Ministry of Magic. Her goal was to take control of the school, remove Dumbledore from power, and ensure that Hogwarts followed the Ministry's line. One of her first actions was to begin evaluating the professors, determining who was suitable to continue teaching and who should be fired. For Sybill, this was terrifying. She knew her subject was viewed with contempt by many, knew her predictions rarely materialized the way she presented them. And now there was this horrible woman, dressed all in pink, sitting in her classes with a clipboard, noting everything, asking invasive questions, clearly looking for reasons to fire her. And Umbridge found those reasons, or at least created the justifications she needed. On a devastating afternoon, Sybill was called to a meeting in the entrance hall. There, in front of students and professors, Umbridge publicly announced that Sybill was being fired. She should pack her bags and leave the castle immediately. It was humiliating, it was cruel. Sybill broke down in tears right there, her bags already prepared beside her, with nowhere to go. She had spent decades at Hogwarts. It was her home, her refuge. The only place where she felt she had some purpose, even if questioned. But then Dumbledore intervened. With his authority as headmaster, he declared that while Umbridge might have the power to fire professors, she didn't have the power to expel them from the castle. That was the headmaster's prerogative. And Dumbledore made it clear that Sybill could continue residing at Hogwarts for as long as she wished. It was a small relief amid the disaster. At least she wouldn't be thrown out on the street. But Sybill was devastated. She went up to her tower, sinking into self-pity and sherry, feeling that she had failed completely, that her life had been a waste, that she would never be worthy of the Trelawney name. Dumbledore, however, had another plan. He couldn't allow the Divination professor position to remain vacant, not with Umbridge present. So he hired Firenze, a centaur from the Forbidden Forest, to take over the Divination classes. This was simultaneously a relief and a humiliation for Sybill. On one hand, she hadn't been completely replaced, as Dumbledore made it clear she would resume her duties as soon as possible. On the other hand, her position had been given to a centaur, and Sybill had all the typical prejudices of many wizards regarding centaurs, considering them inferior. It was during this dark period that something extraordinary happened again. Sybill was wandering through the corridors of Hogwarts, probably slightly inebriated from sherry, when she met Harry Potter in the 7th floor corridor. She was upset because she had tried to hide some empty sherry bottles and had been frustrated somehow. She was complaining, half incoherent, when she suddenly went into a trance again. Her voice changed, became harsh and deep, and she uttered her second true prophecy. The Dark Lord lies alone and friendless, abandoned by his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will break free and set out to rejoin his master. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant, greater and more terrible than ever he was. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will set out to rejoin his master. And then she came to, with no memory whatsoever of what she had said, confused about why she was standing in the corridor, looking at Harry Potter. Harry, of course, understood the importance of those words immediately. He ran to warn Dumbledore. The prophecy was referring to Peter Pettigrew, who had been captured and was a prisoner, and who that night would escape to reunite with Voldemort, helping him return to power. And again, Sybill had no awareness of having made a true prophecy. Two crucial moments, two prophecies that changed the course of wizarding history, and she didn't remember either of them. In time, the situation at Hogwarts was resolved. Umbridge was removed from the castle after a series of events involving centaurs and her own cruelty turning against her. Sybill was reinstated as Divination Professor. She returned to her tower, to her classes, to her dramatic predictions. Life seemed to have returned to normal, or at least to what was normal for Sybill Trelawney. But then came the year 1997, and Hogwarts was besieged. Voldemort had returned to full power. The Death Eaters controlled the Ministry of Magic. Severus Snape, whom everyone believed to be a traitor and murderer, had become headmaster of Hogwarts. The castle had become a dark, dangerous place, where students were punished with torture and fear permeated every corridor. Sybill continued teaching during this terrible period, although her classes were monitored, although she lived in constant fear. She knew the Death Eaters had no patience for divination, and that she could be an easy target. And then came that night, the night of May 2nd, 1998, the Battle of Hogwarts. Voldemort and his army of Death Eaters, giants, acromantulas, and other creatures of darkness attacked the castle. Professors, older students, members of the Order of the Phoenix, all united to defend Hogwarts. It was a war, violent and bloody, determining the future of the entire wizarding world. And Sybill Trelawney, the eccentric professor many underestimated, whom many considered a fraud, showed there was more to her than it appeared. During the battle, she fought. Sybill climbed to the top of her tower and began throwing crystal balls at the Death Eaters invading the castle. Those heavy glass spheres became deadly weapons in her hands. She knocked down Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf, hitting him with a crystal ball right on the head, temporarily knocking him out. She screamed as she fought, her high-pitched voice echoing through the corridors, throwing ball after crystal ball with surprising accuracy. It was simultaneously absurd and heroic. Here was a woman who had spent decades looking into crystal balls, trying to see the future. And now she was using them as weapons to fight for everyone's future. The battle was long, brutal, devastating. Many died that night. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, and so many others lost their lives defending Hogwarts. But in the end, Harry Potter defeated Voldemort. Sybill's prophecy, the one she had made so many years ago without remembering, finally came completely true. One of the two had died at the hand of the other. Harry had survived, the wizarding world was free. And Sybill, she survived the battle. She remained at Hogwarts. After the war, life in the castle slowly returned to some form of normalcy. Hogwarts was rebuilt. Physical wounds were healed, although emotional ones took much longer. Sybill continued as Divination Professor, returning to her classes, to her tea readings, to her dramatic predictions. But something had changed in her. She had fought in a real battle, had faced Death Eaters, had proven, if not to others, at least to herself, that she had courage, that she had value beyond her supposed abilities of seeing. Now let's delve deeper into aspects of Sybill's personality and life that are fascinating and revealing. Sybill Trelawney was a deeply insecure woman. Her entire life had been dominated by the shadow of Cassandra Trelawney, by the expectation that she would inherit that legendary gift. And when it became clear she didn't have visions regularly, that she wasn't a seer like her great-great-grandmother, this insecurity took deep root in her psyche. She compensated for this in various ways. Her appearance was deliberately constructed to seem mystical and ethereal. She wore necklaces and chains, enormous glasses that magnified her eyes to gigantic proportions, giving her an insect-like appearance. Her hair was arranged to seem simultaneously elaborate and disheveled. Everything about her screamed mysterious seer, but in a way that seemed more fantasy than reality. Her voice was high-pitched, nebulous, deliberately theatrical. She spoke in dramatic whispers, made pauses for effect, used flowery language full of omens. It was a constant performance, an attempt to convince others and herself that she was what she pretended to be. And the sherry. Sybill drank a lot of sherry. It wasn't exactly a secret, although she tried to be discreet about it. Alcohol was her way of dealing with constant anxiety, with the feeling of fraud that haunted her, with the loneliness of her isolated life in the tower. But here's what is truly tragic and ironic about Sybill Trelawney. She really did have the gift. She really was a true seer. But the gift manifested so rarely and in a way she couldn't control or even remember that she could never enjoy the validation she so sought. Her two true prophecies were moments of unconsciousness. She would go into a trance. Her conscious mind was completely nullified, and something older, deeper, something connected to the gift inherited from Cassandra took over and spoke through her. But as soon as the prophecy ended, Sybill came to without any memory of what had occurred. Imagine the frustration of that. Imagine spending your entire life trying to have a true vision, and then finally having not one, but two of the most important prophecies in decades, and not remembering either of them. Not being able to point to them and say, "See, I have the gift. I am a true seer." Dumbledore knew, of course. He had witnessed the first prophecy, and certainly learned of the second through Harry. He knew Sybill had the true gift, but he never told her directly, never gave her that validation, because doing so would reveal the content of the prophecies, which would put Sybill in even greater danger. So Sybill continued her life, insecure, doubting herself, compensating with theatricality and alcohol, not knowing that she had truly fulfilled Cassandra Trelawney's legacy in an extraordinary way. Her relationship with the other professors was complex. As I mentioned, Minerva McGonagall had little patience for divination and by extension for Sybill. But there was a basic respect there, especially after McGonagall saw Sybill being humiliated by Umbridge. In that moment, any personal animosity was set aside in favor of solidarity among colleagues. Dumbledore treated Sybill with kindness, but also with a certain distance. He knew the importance of her prophecies, but also saw all her flaws and eccentricities. He protected her, certainly, but there wasn't a relationship of true closeness there. Harry had a complicated relationship with her. He was frequently the target of her darkest predictions, which was irritating and disturbing. But at the same time, Harry had witnessed Sybill make a true prophecy, had seen that transformation when she went into a trance. So he knew there was something real there, even though most of the time Sybill seemed to just be making things up. The prophecy about Harry and Voldemort deserves a deeper analysis here because it is central to the entire Harry Potter story and to Sybill's role in it. The prophecy said that a child would be born with the power to defeat Voldemort, born to parents who had defied him 3 times, born at the end of the 7th month. It said Voldemort would mark this child as his equal, but that the child would have a power Voldemort didn't know. And that in the end, one would have to die at the hand of the other, for neither could live while the other survived. As we discussed, 2 babies fit the criteria: Harry and Neville. Voldemort chose Harry, partially because Harry was half-blood like Voldemort himself, while Neville was pure blood. By choosing Harry, by attacking him, Voldemort fulfilled part of the prophecy, marking Harry as his equal. But there was more to the prophecy than just that. It mentioned a power Voldemort didn't know. Dumbledore revealed to Harry years later that this power was love, the ability to love, to care deeply about others, to sacrifice oneself for them. It was something that Voldemort, in his quest for power and immortality, had completely sacrificed, becoming incapable of understanding or using that kind of magic. When Lily Potter sacrificed herself to save Harry, she created an ancient and powerful protection through her love. It was this protection that made Voldemort's death curse rebound. It was this protection that saved Harry repeatedly over the years. And in the end, in the Forbidden Forest, when Harry walked voluntarily to his death to save everyone else, he activated that same sacrifice magic. He survived again, and Voldemort, who understood nothing about love or sacrifice, was finally defeated. All this because Sybill Trelawney went into a trance in a pub in Hogsmeade so many years ago. Think of the chain of events that prophecy unleashed. If Sybill hadn't made that prophecy, Voldemort never would have hunted the Potters. Harry would have grown up with his parents. There would be no boy who lived. The story would have been completely different. But here's the fascinating philosophical question. Did the prophecy create the future, or simply reveal something that was already destined to happen? Dumbledore discussed this with Harry. He explained that prophecies only have power if people believe in them and act based on them. If Voldemort had ignored the prophecy, if he hadn't tried to kill Harry, perhaps none of this would have happened. It was Voldemort's attempt to prevent the prophecy that actually made it come true. It's a classic temporal paradox, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The very act of trying to avoid it ensured it would materialize. And Sybill was unaware of any of this. She lived during all these years, during the entire war against Voldemort, without knowing that she had initiated that entire chain of events with a prophecy she didn't remember making. Let's now talk about an interesting aspect where Sybill's prophecy was stored. In the Ministry of Magic, in the Department of Mysteries, there was a room called the Hall of Prophecy. It was a huge room, full of shelves that extended in all directions, each carrying thousands of glowing glass spheres. Each sphere contained a recording of a genuine prophecy. Sybill's prophecy about Harry and Voldemort was there, stored in one of those spheres. The sphere had a label with the names of those involved, the Dark Lord and Harry Potter. Only those mentioned in the prophecy could remove it from the shelf and listen to it. During Harry's 5th year at Hogwarts, Voldemort, who knew of the prophecy's existence but didn't know its complete content, tried desperately to gain access to it. He knew it was stored in the Department of Mysteries, but couldn't retrieve it personally, as he wasn't directly mentioned in the prophecy. So he manipulated Harry, planting false visions in his mind through the connection they shared, trying to lure Harry to the Department of Mysteries so he would take the prophecy. This resulted in the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, where several members of the Order of the Phoenix and young students fought against Death Eaters. During this battle, the sphere containing the prophecy was destroyed. It fell and broke, and with it was destroyed the only physical recording of Sybill's words. But Dumbledore, who had heard the original prophecy, still remembered it, and it was he who finally revealed the complete content to Harry. Sybill was inconsolable when she learned her prophecy had been destroyed, not because she remembered making it, but because it was her only tangible proof that she had actually produced a true prophecy that had been considered important enough to be stored at the Ministry. And now that proof was lost. After the war, after Voldemort was defeated and Hogwarts was rebuilt, life slowly returned to some form of normalcy. Sybill remained as divination professor. Firenze eventually returned to the Forbidden Forest and his herd, although his relationship with other centaurs had been permanently damaged by having worked so closely with wizards. Sybill returned to her tower, to her classes full of perfume and reddish light, to her tea readings and her dramatic predictions. She continued drinking her sherry, continued making her nebulous performances, continued being seen as eccentric and unreliable by most people. But she had fought in the Battle of Hogwarts. She had thrown crystal balls at Death Eaters. She had demonstrated courage and determination when it really mattered. And although she didn't know it, her prophecies had completely shaped the course of modern wizarding history. Without her first prophecy, Voldemort never would have pursued Harry Potter. Without her second prophecy, Harry wouldn't have been alerted about Voldemort's imminent return to power. Sybill Trelawney was a fraud most of the time, but in the moments that really mattered, she was everything she pretended to be and more. She spent her entire life trying to prove she had her great-great-grandmother's gift, not knowing she really had it. She longed for recognition and validation, not realizing she had already produced some of the most important prophecies in decades. It was a tragic and ironic existence, but there was also a certain beauty in it. Sybill never gave up. Even when ridiculed, even when humiliated by Umbridge, even when replaced by Firenze, she continued. She continued teaching, continued practicing her art, continued believing there was something more in her. And she was right. There was something more. Much more than anyone, including herself, really understood. The story of Sybill Trelawney teaches us several important things. It teaches us that we shouldn't judge people only by appearance or superficial behavior. Beneath the exaggerated theatricality and dramatic predictions, there was a woman with a genuine gift, although rare and uncontrollable. It teaches us about the pressure of family expectations, about how legacy can be both a blessing and a curse. Sybill spent her entire life trying to live up to the Trelawney name, not realizing she had already surpassed Cassandra in terms of historical impact, even if not in terms of frequent prophecies. It teaches us about loneliness and isolation. Sybill lived much of her life alone in her tower, avoiding social interactions, drinking to deal with constant anxiety and insecurity. It was a lonely existence, and although partially self-imposed, it was also a result of how others treated her. And it teaches us about courage. When the moment of truth came, when Hogwarts was being attacked, Sybill didn't hide in her tower. She fought. She took her crystal balls, tools she had used for decades to try to see the future, and transformed them into weapons to protect the present. Sybill Trelawney will die eventually, as we all will. Perhaps she has even predicted her own death in one of her genuine trances that she won't remember. But when that day comes, she will leave an extraordinary legacy, even if she never has full awareness of it. She will be remembered by students as the eccentric divination professor, the woman with enormous glasses who made dramatic predictions about death. Some will remember her with affection, others with amusement, others still with disdain. But those who know the complete truth, those who know about the prophecies, will understand that Sybill Trelawney was one of the most important figures in the defeat of Voldemort. Without her, without those words uttered in a trance so many years ago, the entire story would have been different. Harry Potter will certainly never forget her. He was the subject of her most famous prophecy. He witnessed one of her true visions. He understands, more than anyone else, the crucial role she played in his life and in the fate of the wizarding world. And perhaps, in her final years, someone will finally tell Sybill about the prophecies she made. Perhaps Dumbledore, before dying, left instructions for her to be informed eventually. Perhaps Harry, years later, will seek her out and tell her the truth about what she really did, about how she really changed the world. Imagine the relief Sybill would feel in that moment. A lifetime of doubt, of insecurity, of feeling like a fraud, finally dissipated by the truth that she really had the gift, that she really was worthy of the Trelawney name, that Cassandra would be proud. Or perhaps she'll never know. Perhaps she'll spend the rest of her days still doubting herself, still making her dramatic performances, still trying to prove something she already proved long ago. Either way, the truth remains. Sybill Trelawney was one of the most important figures in modern wizarding history, and her story is one of the most fascinating and tragically ironic of the entire Harry Potter universe. Sybill Trelawney, the seer who didn't know she was a seer, the professor everyone underestimated, the woman who changed the world without knowing. Her story is about seeking validation, about carrying the weight of impossible expectations, about finding courage in the darkest moments, and about having an extraordinary impact in ways we never imagined. She began her journey as a girl, desperately trying to live up to her great-great-grandmother's legacy. She ended her journey having surpassed that legacy in ways she never could have predicted, ironically, despite all her attempts to predict the future. And in the end, perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The seer who spent her life trying to see the future couldn't see the extraordinary impact she herself would have on it. This is the complete story of Sybill Trelawney, divination professor at Hogwarts, descendant of Cassandra Trelawney, creator of the prophecy that defined a generation, and one of the unrecognized heroines of the Second Wizarding War. A complex, flawed, tragic woman, but in the end truly extraordinary. And so ends the fascinating journey of Sybill Trelawney, the woman who lived between the mist of uncertainty and the devastating clarity of true prophecies. Her life reminds us that we don't always recognize our own worth, that sometimes our greatest achievements happen in moments we can't even remember, and that true greatness can be hidden beneath layers of insecurity and theatricality. Sybill spent decades trying to prove she had the gift, not knowing she had already used that gift to change the fate of the entire wizarding world. She fought against doubt, against the contempt of others, against her own insecurities, and yet remained firm in her tower, looking into crystal balls and tea leaves, searching for answers she had already given long ago. If you enjoyed this story, leave your like, share it with other Harry Potter fans, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you in the next story. And until then, remember, just like Sybill, we all have gifts and strengths we may not yet recognize in ourselves. Sometimes we are much more extraordinary than we imagine.